My last topic, I took a more hands-on approach to look at and talk about my thoughts on how good designers attempt to make use of screen space. And in that I included the Vertizontal, as it sort of ends up being a hybrid as a 4x3 concept. I don't totally like the Vertizontal though. Now I think the Vertizontal is a completely viable method of design, one with a very rich design history in fact. I always have been a fan of caravan games, as someone who spends a lot more time trying to optimize scoring in small sections than other people take to clear whole games, But but I don't really enjoy Vertizontals as full experiences. Maybe as a section, like an Axelay, but as a full 30 to 40 minute experience, I think they tend to be very mixed bags. I mean, ultimately, it's just a matter of taste. At least to me, I'm someone who prefers 90s to 2000s horizontals, and I think there are a lot of flaws pertaining to how they've been designed and how they developed in response to those problems of the screen. To me, the fundamental problem of the Vertizontal begins with its unfortunate beginnings. In the early home market, many of the earlier games still treated 4x3 as if it were 3x4, and it's not the fault of the developer. They were always almost arcade ports. Truxton's famous Genesis port, cuts off the top of the screen, but the formations still function as they do in the original arcade. The sizes are the same, so it makes the game feel cluttered compared to the original. Actually, the sizes might be a little bigger. Because of the prevalence of ports on the home market, the Vertizontal grew up in the shadow of the arcade and arcade concepts, when in reality, new philosophical approaches needed to be developed, just as ones were for horizontal games with Gradius, Darius, and R-Type. To really think about the Vertizontal, you need to ignore the concepts that were developed in 3x4 and focus everything to be made specifically for that screen space. And if you look at something like Star Soldier in 86, you'll see how the 4x3 ratio creates a lot of trouble for design at the very beginning. You can tell there's an idea of what to do, but it's all not quite there when trying to figure out the screen space in the way the screen scrolls both vertically and horizontally with the player, and how the way the enemy formations float around create a much more archaic experience than arcade games at the time. And when you start to take that core shooter concept from it, but you lose that vertical space, everything ends up feeling a lot more crowded, and you're spending more time shimmying around the screen playing all over it. This also means that the way enemies have to move is just as compact as the player, and their formations need to move in patterns that can be, at times, very disorienting, because they'll move in asymmetrical zigzag patterns to make use of the wider but shorter space. So you have to look at that 5-way shot in Star Soldier as an attempt of dealing with this more centrally focused screen space. And that's the first key development in this style. The developers associated with Caravan games, Naxat, Hudson, Compile, took this core idea in Star Soldier and they expanded to some new design ideas for games that were first and foremost home games, existing in 4x3 from the start. One where multiple shot types start to exist to hit at certain angles or every angle, and they're basing the shots on the position you have to access certain corners of the screen. In 3x4, having access to any and all corners of the screen requires some drawback where having access to an angle or section of said screen comes at the cost of losing access to another one. Otherwise, you find these parts where you can shimmy around to a sweet spot and hit every enemy and avoid all the bullets. The design principle of the total plan lane becomes essential in these situations because it feeds the player to a certain direction and prevents them from taking advantage of all the corners. In 4x3, the wider screen leads to longer travel time, so generally Vertizontals are built around the use of many weapons that you're encouraged to switch frequently, making routing in each section sort of dependent on certain weapon combinations. Core to the Vertizontal design philosophy that seemed to develop via these three Caravan developers is a sort of controlled chaos, where the slimmer ratio of 3x4 focused on calculated paths and strong linear motion, and the 4x3 horizontal focused on a slower pace dictated by terrain. The 4x3 Vertizontal emphasizes speed and constant twitch movement between smaller spaces, with many making use of ground objects or terrain that will block or be destroyed by bullets, a sort of mashing the Xevious bomb targets with the Gradius destructible walls. In some sense, though, there's actually a lot more similarity to pre-Xevious games, more than their horizontal and vertical peers of the era, where the pacing is more dictated by waves that move in a more wild fashion. They fire quickly and they leave quickly. Like in Galaga, there's also a clearly more of a focus on enemies not only shooting at you, but flying directly in your direction. And enemies more frequently extend to the bottom of the screen instantly in their formations, which is a trait distinct from vertical games, where enemies often spend more time above the center of the screen, but they fire more bullets. Instead, enemies in these games often fire very little bullets in very simple patterns, because they tend to take up more screen space and are more treated as obstacles, not unlike horizontal games. To me, all of these little details mean that vertizontal design should, or at least generally does, focus less on moving from one side of the screen to the other and back, and be more ultimately focused on slow, gradual movements between a section of the screen instead of the whole. Making use of the full screen can happen during the course of a stage, but smaller chunks of the stage would be focused in certain zones or areas of that scene, resulting in what is basically lanes within larger lanes. And as the Caravan Summer Carnivals end, and Hudson and Naxat slow their output, Compile becomes the major exponent of the classic vertizontal until their developers leave to form Rising. So when you look at the end of the Carnival, the developer that did the most for the genre was Compile. You see it very clearly in a lot of the games that come out after 95. The use of terrain and obstacles. The focus on cycling through different shot types for specific sections. Prioritizing the enemy formations directly targeting the player over a density of bullets. It's really important to look at it and appreciate the amount of work that was done in this Carnival style that had a profound influence on how we view this aspect ratio, how we develop for it. It goes all the way back to Star Soldier at the very beginning. And even in the widescreen era, 4x3 has stood as the vertizontal standard, whereas horizontal games have moved to 16:9, and there have been movements towards 16:9 in vertical games. The vertizontal still holds 4x3. However, there is one arrange that I think properly expresses how vertizontal games should tackle 16:9 in the future. This section sort of covers two topics. First deals with what an arrangement really means in the context of the arcade original, and the second being why New Order represents the platonic ideal of vertizontal design in 16:9, not in mechanics, but in philosophy, and why it should be considered a foundational text for 16:9 design in the way the Caravan style was for 4x3 vertizontals. I primarily view design as mostly philosophical, not mechanical. You can list off mechanics in like 20 games in a video, like a lot of design videos do, and you can get like the what of design. And you might scrape the how, but you'll never scrape the why, because when you really get down to it and actually look at what we agree good design is, the reasons things are designed in the way they are is related to some core spirit, the soul of a thing, and the mechanics and ideas come from that essence. But the core soul of something is not the what or the how, it comes from the beginning. So when we ask why this arrange is good, the question is not one of quality, but one of philosophy. Does the arrange understand and take advantage of the core, that soul, of the concept? If it's successful, that's because it targets not what the game is or how it works, but why the game is like this. And by result of this why, we can come to the what it needs to be and the how it can be done. That why begins with 3D stage design and the overall inspiration. Now, G-Rev began as a 3D design group. They worked on the backgrounds for Gradius 5 and Ikaruga to raise funds while working on Border Down. And all three of these games have backgrounds that follow basic philosophy, in which there is a background that, while it rotates or moves around, it's essentially just a background. It doesn't have any impact on the core gameplay. and then there's a foreground that's visibly distinct enough to telegraph it as an obstacle. Yet enemies can pop from behind, as in most games, so there is a 3D space, but aside from this, the 3D isn't being used in a way that's environmental. It's not like Einhander or R-Type Delta, or even like the 3D Ray games, where the player exists within a 3D environment, not just projected on top of one, but is within something and interacts with that environment. This is a much more difficult way of working in a genre where equal movement, especially in a game like Einhander, equal movement is incredibly essential, and when you change perspectives and you move around in a 3D space, it makes equal movement difficult to program, and especially easy to read. And these types of games change how the player experiences the environment in a way different than, say, Radiant Silvergun or Philosoma, where the perspective is distinct from the player, it's a background, and the enemies and the player are a projection upon that background. Now, Under Defeat as a game occupies three-dimensional space like the Ray series, but not like Einhander, so there's no perspective shifts or camera changes. However, there are specific gameplay quirks that are reminiscent of what we know from horizontal shooters. The stage being slightly larger than the screen space or the camera space, and everything's persistent, even when it's off screen or not. The bullets will stay, the enemies will stay. It's like Thunder Force 4, where you can move the camera and the enemies will still be in those positions, and you can go to different parts of the stage that you're not there, and the enemies already spawned and ready to fire. However, in comparison, the amount the screen moves isn't really that much. The essential design of Under Defeat is still 4x3, just with a little extra space. That being said, I would wager that 16x9 was being taken into consideration in designing the stages themselves, almost as if they knew ahead of time they wanted to re-release it for a larger screen space. I mean, it was one of the last games put out for the Naomi and the Dreamcast. By that time, widescreen screens had already been prevalent around. 4x3 was basically on its way out, and I can't prove it, but Gira is generally a very forward-thinking company interested in taking new twists to fundamental concepts, so there's no reason to not believe it's possible. Now, Under Defeat at its core is Tiger Heli for the modern arcade. The enemy formations and the way the player routes the game recalls a more asymmetrical arcade design prior to the proper codification of the Toaplan pattern or the Toaplan lanes. The main Zako being tanks means that, unlike games where you fight flying enemies, a majority of the enemies are environmental and fully determined by that environment, coming not only from the top of the screen but all sorts of angles and on the side, just like in Tiger Heli. Because we're focused more on grounded enemies, this also means that the paths the player takes are distinct from those in contemporary Danmaku, with more twitch movement, which speaks more to the old-school nature of the game. In order to emphasize this more staggered and varied gameplay, the core mechanic of angling the helicopter allows for G-Rev to create situations more complex and challenging, based on the stage design totally, without having to create patterns more complex than scattered fire or radial shots. In some way, New Order's arrange also calls back to the era of the 4.3 arcade port, making use of 16x9 in the way the old 4x3 ports of arcade games used to do it, where you cut off the top of the screen and you zoom in to prevent black bars. For many older games, this created a problem unique to ports that didn't exist in games designed specifically for that square ratio. Often changes were meaningful in a very negative way, taking away more from the core game than they add. And in Under Defeat, this actually does to some degree change the gameplay, but when compared to older examples, it adds a lot more in practice than it takes away in theory. There are new enemies in places that alter routing sections. For example, in Stage 1, the addition of an extra tank allows for more opportunities to chain options. Though, to be honest, I haven't really figured it out yet, optimized in New Order. I've been trying to figure this out, but it's tough to figure out the positioning for this. However, what I found in those sections that remained unchanged in terms of enemies is that the distinctions between it and the arcade are much more interesting than just the addition of a few more enemies, to the point where the same position can have completely new routing to be taken advantage of. Or that routing has to change due to differences in spacing. Or places where the crop and zoom creates a more claustrophobic atmosphere in sections that were already pretty tight in the arcade original, not unlike experiences found in the old arcade ports, or even in Rekka. This part reminds me a lot of some Rekka bosses. However, in New Order, due to the flexibility of the game's mechanics, these situations don't feel as if you're being put in a situation any more disadvantageous than in the arcade. In reality, the situation has changed, but you still have all the tools you need to be successful. The speed of your turn and the overall angle have changed in such a way to allow for a comfortable approach to the stouter playfield. It doesn't alter the game at all, and it actually augments it very well. Generally, as an arrange, the focus of a mode is to take that core of the arcade original and offer a new perspective into viewing the game concept. A bad arrange really fails in terms of coherency, in that the vision of the arrange doesn't fit the core concept, because the arrange shouldn't just be different patterns or formations alone for the purpose of extra content. That's more this mechanical versus philosophical question. The mechanical approach to arrange is like a difficulty ROM hack. You make it Kaizo to the extreme as a test of mechanical skill. It's an endeavor that sort of ignores the nuance of the original in favor of hitting you with like blunt force trauma. It's difficult now, or it's different now. The philosophical approach is more like an expansion of the concept by augmentation. If we were to continue by that ROM hack analogy, instead of something being Kaizo, changing the stages, it would be more keeping the stages as they are, but altering how you approach them. Like how a route split hack for Fire Emblem Sacred Stones I've been playing allows you to split your team into 2 groups instead of picking one of the story routes, allowing the game to be viewed in a different way. You play both routes with a smaller set of characters. What that to me is arranging, but it's not necessarily just adding or taking away. What it also is changing how it's perceived. And an example I really like that I think really illustrates this concept perfectly is the Stage 2 boss, where the ways in which you can break down the ship changes depending on the aspect ratio. In the arcade version, you're given the middle of the ship first, and much of your focus is pointed there. However, in the arrange, you can immediately take out the guns on the front of the ship. This offers an alternative way of viewing routing. How am I going to do this? Am I going to still take the middle section, or am I going to go to the left and start to take out some other parts first? On the other side of the ship, the length of the arrange alters the angles of some of the gunshots of the big guns. And in the arcade version, the height of the aspect ratio allows you to deal a lot of damage to the weak point of the boss before the fight starts outright, or at least before the bar appears. And this is an exploit that can't occur in the arrange because the top of the screen is cut off. It's subtle differences like this, not major mechanical ones, even though there are slight mechanical changes usually. It's those things that make an arrange interesting to play. So we can say I think New Order is successful at arranging the arcade original, but why should this be important for approaching 16:9? It's just an arrange of something initially designed for 4:3. How does this offer a solution to the problem of 16:9 and the future of the Vertizontal? I'll begin by saying, I think it's obvious from my takes already, I don't like 16:9 or 9:16 at all. It's far too long. And though I do enjoy what little time I can get out of playing Akata Blue at my local arcade, it deals more with the aspect ratio by making Danmaku more like bowling than Dodonpachi. I just think the problem is that there's too much screen space to focus on for games that require rapid threat identification. The more screen you have, the more visual noise you can fill it with, but I think this becomes counterproductive at some point. I honestly believe that Danmaku really works best at the 4:3 ratio, and anymore there's just too much visual clutter. So what's up with New Order then? Under Defeat works because at its core, it was never Danmaku. Okay, there's a lot of bullets, sure, but it's not really that hard to read. I can read it. I'm not even good at vertical games, and I can easily get to stage 5. Stage 3 boss, I gotta learn that one. I'll be honest, I'm just kind of bombing my way through sections of it. And then praying my way through stage 4. If you get hit, it's more likely you made a mistake and ran into a stray, or you just put yourself into that situation. In the horizontal space, most 16:9 games tend to skew towards being closer in design to Danmaku than usually horizontal games were traditionally. Because the wider space and compared to 4:3 means there's less room for the player to move all around the screen as they do in the classic examples. In the same way, the Vertizontal makes for an iffy Danmaku because that type of game excels where there's enough vertical space to allow for varied and gradually changing bullet patterns. Because the point of complexity in Danmaku isn't the number of bullets, it's the complexity of the pattern itself and how it changes as it travels. The more constricted your space is, then the less space there is for that sort of pattern complexity over time. New Order also works because, like the classic Vertizontals, the core mechanics of the game emphasize less on what is in front of you and more on what is all around you at varying angles. Yet unlike the 4:3 Vertizontal, it isn't trying to throw bodies at you directly. None of the enemies flying at you approach the player's space like Compile's popcorn. No, they appear, they fire bullets and leave. Now there are some that take paths that appear that they can collide with the player, but they function like the bullets from grounded enemies as sort of extra noise rather than bodies. In contrast, all of these things all around you are grounded, meaning that you don't have to worry about being boxed in by tanks and artillery. but they still represent threats in terms of firing bullets. Again, New Order is, in some way, an answer to the Tiger Heli port, just as the arcade original is an answer to Tiger Heli. If this were a 16x9 Vertizontal made in the Summer Carnival style, with all sorts of flying enemies coming in from the front and the back and the sides, firing directly at the player, it would ultimately be too closed in, simply by virtue of less verticality. The 4x3 Vertizontal is designed as it is because of all the sides are effectively equal. And that doesn't apply to any version of any widescreen aspect ratio, because the format is inherently imbalanced. The way in which the arrange is zoomed in is carefully tuned to the needs of the conceptualized playfield and the realities of the screen space. I made the note before that one of the big distinctions between vertizontals and verticals is that sprite sizes increase to deal with the additional space. Zooming in fulfills the necessary requirement of focusing the eye and limiting visual clutter. When you have a game in 16x9 that doesn't properly take into account how much should be drawn on the screen, and how much is too much, not because of engine limitations, but because of visual clutter itself, then you end up with a game that doesn't take into account the space it inhabits. If you compare Star Soldier and Musha, you can illustrate how designers ultimately decided how they wanted the relationship of the objects to the space to be for 4x3. But it takes time and a lot of work to find that proper relationship to the screen. If you look forward to Mars Matrix, then you'll see a different approach to the objects in relationship to the screen, because the core idea of what the game is going to be requires some reflection on these relationships. And it's up to the experience and knowledge of the genre, not a strict adherence to it, that allows for well-designed games, no matter the screen space. I think Underdefeat's success in the genre of the 16x9 Vertizontal is making the game both vertical and horizontal in a way that 4x3 Vertizontals never really did. Because all the past Vertizontals still stuck to the concept of being a vertical game. They're always moving up, there's very little movement sideways or around with the camera. Unlike horizontal games which embraced in 4x3, knowing it's a box, camera and the stage had to move a lot more, there had to be a lot more movement. G-Rev looked to that wider ratio and decided to take advantage of a lot of horizontal motion in the stage and enemy formation design. If New Order is successful, it's because the stages, first and foremost, are designed to move vertically, horizontally, and diagonally, and the enemies are not spawned as if in a vertical game from the top of the screen, but from many places all over the screen. However, because the question's philosophical, there really isn't a single answer, because the answer to a problem like this requires us to step away from genre conventions. When the Caravan games first began, the developers had to define new ways of thinking about a shooting game, because all that a shooting game is shooting and dodging. While retaining those core values of the early arcade, the designer needs to look at the problem of the screen first, to tradition second, and then third to use their knowledge and experience to design the best possible way around that problem. Instead of trying to force the idea onto the screen should become a container for that idea.